Home values across Australia continue to rise, although for the month of September we have seen somewhat of a slowdown in that level of growth. RP Data's Cameron Cusher joins me now to look at some of the numbers for the month of September. Overall, what was the headline rise?
Well, values are up 0.1% over the month, which is a very sharp slowdown from what we saw the previous month. If we look on a day-to-day basis, the first half of the month was very soft. We saw values falling, and they started to come up again during the middle of the month. But overall, obviously, a slowdown in the rate of capital growth, and I guess that's a theme we're starting to see overall in the data.
Spring is traditionally a very busy time, especially on the auction market in Sydney and Melbourne. The pullback, volumes are also dropping slightly in terms of the number of auctions as well. Do you think this is going to affect the overall performance of the spring selling season this year?
I think so. If we actually have a look last year, the winter months were actually stronger in terms of capital growth than the spring months, and obviously we had a very strong winter period for capital growth this year. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see slightly weaker conditions again this spring. We're seeing new listings climb. As you said, volumes are down a little bit. In terms of transactions, we're also lower than where we were at the same time last year. And obviously when you've had 2.5 years of capital growth, particularly focused on Sydney and Melbourne, at some point people aren't going to be as able to afford those properties that are available for sale. And I think we're starting to see perhaps the first signs of that happening now. We
talk about the capital cities really driving the overall growth, and of course in Australia some of the regional areas are struggling to keep up, or in fact actually declining. When you look at the 5 top capital cities that sort of go under the hammer each weekend, Sydney is still increasing in September. We're seeing the others pull back in terms of their value.
That's right. I mean, month to month it can be a little bit of noise in the data, but if you have a look at the longer trend, if you look over the last 12 months, Sydney values are up more than 14%, and then you drop all the way to just over 8% in Melbourne. The key point though is that the rate of growth in those two cities, which have been exceptionally strong, is starting to moderate. At a national level, we saw capital growth on an annualised basis peak in April, and it started to pull back since then. So that's encouraging. And on the other hand, we're starting to see some of the other capital cities which have really underperformed, like Brisbane, Adelaide and Hobart, starting to show some signs of growth. And again, as people are priced out of Sydney and Melbourne, maybe they're starting to look to these other capital cities.
So a slowdown in the level of growth, a stabilisation of sorts. No bubble's about to burst, is it?
It certainly doesn't look that way. As I said, we're starting to see over the last few weeks a couple of weeks of some capital growth, and I think obviously the Reserve Bank is watching what happens in Sydney and Melbourne very closely, but it doesn't look like we're in a position where any sort of bubble is going to burst. Interest rates are likely to remain on hold. Mortgage arrears are still very low, and people are showing a lot of faith in the housing market at the moment.
That's right, because Governor Glenn Stevens, of course, did issue somewhat of a warning, certainly that they were looking at the city market particularly, but no real impact on that inflation number, and they're not concerned too much about that. Unlikely to move because of the Sydney housing market.
That's right, and I think the other thing to remember as well, what the Reserve Bank is looking for is to hand over from mining investment to residential construction. They're talking about macro-prudential policies, but they want to be careful not to create a situation where all these approvals they've now got in the pipeline ultimately don't get completed. So it's going to be a real challenge. I think the Reserve Bank's really going to earn their keep over the next 12 months.
So Cameron, overall values on the rise, even if only inching up somewhat over September. Thanks so much for your time. Cam Cusher, RP Data.
Thanks for having me.